All right, it looks like some folks are coming into the room. We're just about at, in fact, we are at the top of the hour, and we'll get underway momentarily, folks. I'm just pointing everybody towards the chat box, and if you could just introduce yourself or just let folks know you're here, that would be fantastic. And again, we'll get started here momentarily. There's Marvis. Nice to see you, Marvis. Glad you're here. All right. And I'll get us kicked off here momentarily. I'm just trying to give everybody an opportunity to get in. And all right. When I hit 2 after, I'll start us off just because it's respectful of the start time for everybody. So we'll give folks about another 60 seconds and get underway. All right, Melissa, are you ready to pull up a PowerPoint?
PowerPoint's up and ready to go.
Fantastic. All right, folks, so let us get this show on the road. It's 1:03 my time, and I'm in the Central Time Zone, so 2:03 for those folks on the eastern side of the country, and it's earlier on the western side. How's that? So I just want to say good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to today's ORN webinar. This is Increasing Racial Equity in Recovery, and the 3 speakers that we have with us today are all prominent national recovery experts in their own right, and their contributions to local communities and to the global recovery effort, they continue to impact the movement in some significant and positive ways. And I know that for many webinars, I certainly have sat through my share of them. A lot of us do multitask through them because we're all sort of busier than a one-armed wallpaper hanger. But for this one session, I would really ask you all to please just stop whatever else you might be doing. And to the extent possible, and I get this, but you know, to the extent possible, please try to give your full attention to this event, because I think you're going to find that your time has been really well spent with these speakers. So as I go through the next couple of slides, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the participant phone lines will be muted through the presentation. Now, as we enter Q&A, I think Melissa will unmute everybody and we'll be able to talk. But we'll be tackling there's some queued questions, I think, that we'll go through initially. And anything that's submitted in the chat during those presentations, we'll address first. So if you do have questions as you're listening to the presenters, please submit them in the chat, and then we're going to work to answer them during our question and answer period. So let me just share a little bit about the Opioid Response Network. And oddly enough, I don't have that PowerPoint up in front of me. I don't see that, the deck, Melissa. So I'm not sure how best to provide the ORN overview, but what I could do, I think, bear with me one second, is to just pull up what we have and try to get through the ORN information slides, and there we go. I think that's I'm really having some technical difficulties with my computer for some reason. I'm not sure what is happening. So Melissa, I don't know why I don't see the PowerPoint, and then that's just strange.
through those slides if you'd like, Stephen.
Yeah, I don't, they're not in front of me, and I'm not sure what the technical glitch is here, but I don't have them. If Dr. Stewart, if you could just go through the first couple of ORNs, let's get us to, I think it's slide 5.
Yep.
Right? Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank
Yep.
you.
So I know a lot of folks in the room are already probably familiar with this. SAMHSA State Targeted Response Technical Assistant Grant created the Opioid Response Network to assist in STR grantees, individuals and other organizations by providing the resources as well as the technical assistance that they need to locally address the opioid crisis. So the technical assistance is available to support the evidence-based prevention, treatment, and recovery of opioid use disorders. And then ORN provides local experienced consultants in prevention, treatment, and recovery to communities and organizations to help address the opioid crisis. The ORN accepts requests for education and training, as well as each state territory has a designated team, which is led by a regional technology transfer specialist, and that person is an expert in implementing evidence-based practices. And so if you have any questions or would like to submit a technical assistance request, you could do so at the opioidresponsenetwork.org, email orn@aaap.org, or call that number listed on the screen. So if you want to just take a quick snap of that or write that down really quickly, this information will also be provided at the end of the session as well. And now I'm going to pass it back to Stephen to let you meet the presenters.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Stewart. I am grateful. And I think, folks, you've already heard more than enough from me. And again, we're really fortunate to have these 3 speakers with us. So I want to get them going momentarily. We're going to get the discussion started with a brief presentation from Dr. Ashley Stewart. And moving forward, I'll just refer to her as Ashley, but I wanted to make sure that I used the correct introduction for Dr. Stewart. And Dr. Stewart is a C4 training and curriculum development specialist. She's also an assistant professor with Temple University in the College of Public Health at the School of Social Work. And Dr. Stewart also serves as a subject matter expert with C4 Innovations. Once Ashley completes the initial presentation, we're going to move directly into a moderated Q&A session. And it's going to include Ashley, but it'll also include Joe Powell, who is the president and CEO of the Association of Persons Affected by Addiction, APAA. And APAA is a leading recovery community organization in Texas. Joe has participated in several SAMHSA initiatives, including the co-occurring substance use and mental illness report to Congress, the SAMHSA / Center for Mental Health Services, CMHS, and their Dallas County transformation of the mental health system, and the Texas Recovery Initiative. In 1988, Joe started the very first African-American National Alliance for Mental Illness in Dallas, and Joe is also a founding family member of Faces and Voices for Recovery. Alongside Joe comes Daryl McGraw. Daryl is a recovery specialist at C4 Innovations, and Daryl is also the founder and president of Formerly Inc. Daryl is also the former program director for the Yale University Department of Psychiatry, and in this role, he served as the director of the Office of Recovery Community Affairs for Connecticut's Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. Daryl's work in battling addiction and overcoming obstacles facing justice-involved individuals upon their release from prison is inspiring, and he is in high demand to speak in a variety of settings. Now, at the conclusion of the moderated Q&A, Ashley's going to return to close us out with some strategies and steps for change that we hope will be helpful for everybody on the event today. There are 2 learning objectives for our session today. First, describe best practices and promising strategies, highlight key indicators, and discuss challenges and barriers related to advancing racial equity in recovery support settings. And the second objective is to start a critical dialogue about being actionable steps toward supporting inclusive recovery spaces. Okay, so everybody's heard more than enough from me. Let me move on to what you're all here for, And a general reminder again that before we start this, if you do have questions for the presenters, please just ask them in the chat and we'll do our best to get your question answered. And with that, let me turn this over to Ashley and get us underway. Ashley?
Thank you so much. All right, folks, very honored to be here, very grateful to be able to share this space with you all. So I start off with a hypothetical. Don't expect folks to really respond whether you agree or disagree, but I would say that most people agree that people should be treated equally. But when we're talking about equality and equity, there's really some concrete differences that are important to not be minimized in the intent to say that people should be treated equally. Many of you may have seen this graphic before. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of this graphic. However, people have shared that it has been helpful to kind of understand from a perspective, what are some of the differences between equality and equity. I'm going to talk through some of them. So equality is based on the premise that people should be treated the same, that people should be treated equally, that folks should be provided the same opportunity, and that difference shouldn't be seen between people based on different forms of how they identify. Now, while that is certainly a goal, and those are all positive outcomes, what we must be mindful of, especially in this conversation, is that equality does not guarantee equity. Inequity is very critically acknowledging and honoring that there is disparity, that there are critical gaps, and most importantly, that a lot of social models don't support equality because they need to respond to those gaps very urgently. And so when we begin to think about how do we engage in equity, we really think about these initiatives that we've been promoting around diversity, inclusion, and equity, which we can go to the next slide, right? And so more on the aspect of equity being something different and unique, it is appreciating that equality can sometimes take an ahistorical approach. Sometimes things start from anew, but we really want to have a deep appreciation for the context that has led to the different forms of oppression that exist within society, acknowledging our role in contributing to the marginalization and upholding some of those ideas. And when we talk about equality without consideration for the importance of equity, is very easy to contribute incidentally or intentionally to forms of oppression by minimizing those lived narratives. So diversity, inclusion, equity, I hear them all the time, just kind of lumped together, one big term, right? But each term is different. Diversity is important, having people in the space that represent different realities. But a lot of times we go to diversity first. And I think that an important reframe here is essential, especially as you listen to Joe and Daryl talk today about some of the complexities of it, understanding that diversity is one component of it. But if that diverse place or that diverse space does not prioritize that people feel included and are included, able to engage and participate, then the diversity will inevitably be performative or even more exclusionary. And in order for all of that to happen, equity has to be a priority. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, equity is a deeper level of commitment. It's about a critical level of self-awareness, organizational awareness, and may require some extensive culture shift to be able to be at a place to really create a space of equity, to commit to it. So by rearranging and reprioritizing diversity and inclusion to be upheld, sustainable, and as I just mentioned, reducing performative diversity practices. Yeah. So I love that it's usually in that order: diversity, inclusion, and equity, but we really got to start with equity first to ensure inclusive environments for our diverse folk. And then some things, just like almost as if some ground principles for us to consider. This is taken from some of the work of Dr. Ken Hardy in the tasks of the privileged and subjugated. And two of them that I think in framing our conversation today are really important to consider is to resist the false notion of equality. It's not helpful to equate suffering. We want to create room for people's lived narratives to be prioritized. We want to believe folk, but also hear folk and let them be experts in leading us in these really critical shifts that we need to experience. Sometimes our discomfort leads us to a space of minimizing someone else's experience, and we want to push away that urge to do so. And then finally, challenge an ahistorical approach. Some things we'll talk about today are connecting some of these structural forms of oppression that have led to disparity in the ways in which response occurs. And history does matter. The past does affect the present, and some of the things that we consider history are not more than just 30 years ago, right? So when we're talking about history, we're not talking just about non-contemporary issues as well. We're talking about all forms of past experiences that folks are bringing to the table. The privileged cannot understand the subjugated out of context, which is a quote that I think a lot of people like to use and refer to, because there's a context that must be appreciated in order for us to do this work and for it to be intentional and thoughtful and sustainable. And so I'm going to pass it back to Stephen to lead us through some discussion, and folks are welcome to ask questions in the discussion as well.
Fantastic, Ashley. Thank you for that, and just thank you for the sort of rapid overview. I'm going to jump into some questions. We've got Joe, Daryl, and Ashley, and essentially I'm just going to throw these questions out, and I'm going to let our three speakers just respond. So here's the first question. Can you each comment on what this statement means to you? If you're not addressing trauma, you're not addressing racism.
My name is Joe Powell, and I'm a young person in long-term recovery. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Joe.
Great, great, great. So I think for me, I'm gonna have to take off my glasses for this one. Trauma definitely goes back for me. I think that my history, I always say I'm a young person in long-term recovery, and what that means is that I haven't had a drink in 32 years. I haven't used any opiates since 1973. But growing up in Harlem, New York, in the Black community, but also living, being a Black man in the community there where racism showed its with civil rights. I go way back to the civil rights, but I have to go back to the house, even the house that I grew up in, that living there with a dad that was an alcoholic, right? It was very abusive. And I always say that from that trauma, I uncovered and felt unsafe in that house by having a father that was alcoholic. And, and that changed a lot of stuff for me into where I ended up medicating with drugs and alcohol as I got older. But the thing is that trauma started very early, and it was inside the house as well as outside the house. And even the generational trauma, and I didn't know back then, of course. I learned historically that how trauma played a huge part in my life as far as even not only having, I call it PTSS and PTSD. PTSS stands for post-traumatic slave syndrome, meaning that 400 years of African-American trauma, generational trauma that has passed on. And so the deaths that I saw, all of the trauma and drama that I saw in the house as well as outside the house, growing up in New York, watching Malcolm X on the corner, Martin Luther King, Black Panthers, etc. But, going through those civil rights more era. So there's a lot of trauma, but it was all about civil rights. Was about racism, right? It was about, we didn't have any equity. It wasn't no equality, in that. I mean, it was a whole another level of, even Civil Rights Act. How do we even, get the right? Do we have the right? To be human, just to be, as Black people and people of color. So for me, it equates this, and it equates all the way back to growing up as a little baby, is when it's being aware that why is all of this going on around here, with the post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is all about generational trauma. I had to wonder, even today, I'm just now learning that why was Black folks and African Americans so angry, and part of that anger is about that, that's unresolved healing and grief that we have been experiencing for years. Dr. DeGroot, she writes about that. There's the three things that she talked about with post-traumatic slave syndrome. But anyway, for me, we know when we talk about PTSD, we talk about that's traumatic, and people have always associated that with war, of course. And I was in the military also, but the trauma though was very, and all that caused a lot of fear and still PTSD symptoms for me today. So racism, and it goes hand in hand for me. And again, and just like any other ism, I had to, of course, get into recovery from the ism, whether it was alcoholism or whether it was racism, right? And what is the recovery for that? So that's where I'm at right now, Steve.
Joe, thank you. Thank you for that. Ashley or Daryl?
Sure, I'll jump in. Ash, you ready? You ready? So either way, it don't matter. We're ready. Let's get this conversation going. We appreciate everybody coming in. I see Thomas, you're from the Department of Corrections. I appreciate you being here because a lot of my story comes from, I'm a survivor of institutionalization and understanding, grew up in violent environments, urban communities, where violence, was prevalent, but growing up, also having lived 10 years of my life in and out of the Department of Corrections and experiencing a lot of trauma, going into the prison with trauma and coming out, it was more traumatized by just the things that I saw within the prison system. But understanding, similar to what Joe was talking about, as the historical trauma, right? Growing up already, seeing things like, slavery and seeing all of that, having that history of seeing what happened to people before you and being able, even though that didn't happen to me, but just seeing it or reading about it. And many of us, whether black or white, many of us are traumatized by the history, right? But when you see things as like myself, as a black man, watching the news, even today, tomorrow, right? George Floyd on the ground with a police officer's knee in his neck. That's traumatizing to me, right? Because I myself am a survivor of police brutality. So when we're seeing people murdered, abused because of the color of their skin, and you're the color of that skin, imagine how it is to move forward in this country and with those experiences, and then having your own personal lived experience and a history built off of trauma. So we're trying to, in this short period of time, be able to focus on or enlighten you on how trauma can affect those that come before you in your interactions and what level of work you're doing, and understand why people are, how people suffer from trauma, whether it happens directly to them or if it was or if they're suffering from a historical factor. Does that make sense? Thumbs up. It's harder. It was different in Zoom. We're not in the room, so I need y'all to give me some thumbs up. Y'all gotta let me know we're working, man. Sometimes my computer freezes, man. I gotta know y'all in the building.
We're here with you. We're here with you. All right. The question about you cannot, how important it is to acknowledge racism and acknowledging trauma and how there's so much connection to the two brings me back to the idea that we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. And I think the discomfort that comes with talking about racism becomes an extraordinary barrier. Even, as we're providing these examples or context, the discomfort of folks, we refer to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Folks tell me all the time, well, we have to move past that. But I have documentations of some of my ancestors who were freed slaves with my great-great-grandparents. So it's not so far removed. Even, just hearing Daryl, this is the first time I've heard Daryl share, surviving police brutality, myself experiencing different forms of harassment in these areas is critical part of that process. In addition to that, this work in this literature is very much supported through new findings and new innovations within the within epigenetic studies. There's another book that I'm going to type into the chat as well for folks that looks at the continual perpetuation of this type of trauma that is lived very much so in the the stress condition, the physical, physiological, as well as mental health of folk. And so in order to be really transparent about healing, we have to be able to acknowledge the source of it. There's a ton of scholarship on race-based stress, race-based traumatic stress, and the impact that that has on health, on substance use, on family dynamics, in every aspect of life. But if it makes us uncomfortable to talk about, we cannot begin to respond to these issues. And that makes it urgent. That makes it urgent that we all get comfortable and ready to begin to appreciate this very real reality for the communities that we intend to serve. So yeah, Holly, absolutely. I'm going to share some more resources in the chat, as well as specifically as it relates to racism and trauma.
Fantastic, Ashley. Thank you. And Daryl, thank you as well. Joe, always. Much appreciated. I've got a second question coming. And this one really just resonates with me. We've all likely heard about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and their connection to an increased likelihood of future substance use. But can we talk about adverse community experiences? And what would be some examples, and how can those experiences similarly and negatively impact an individual?
Well, I could go first again. Hey, Joe Powell here, still a young person in long-term recovery. I guess for me, early on in the community, I talked about growing up in Harlem, in the Harlem Renaissance, and and all of that. And I was an entertainer also on stage, but and I entertained for a lot of people. But in the community, we didn't do much entertaining in the community. Even though the Apollo Theater was right down the street, but I was mainly entertaining for white people, right? And we did a lot of shows. I even did, Madison Square Garden with Sammy Davis, Frank Sinatra. I did shows with all of them for 15 years, But the thing is that the community though was still blight, even in Harlem. I mean, even though the resources was great and what you saw, civil rights was at the top, in the community. So it wasn't, a community where, of course we had, everything was lovey-dovey. Everything was lovey-dovey, but it wasn't as much as entertaining and getting paid for it, where we had to go outside of Harlem, to get paid. And then we did shows at the nightclubs. There was nightclubs and action, and it's always showtime with that. But even when Martin Luther King got killed, Martin Luther King got killed in Harlem at City College. I mean, I was entertaining at City College. City College, New York City College sits up on a hill in Harlem, right? And so we was just getting ready to go on the stage, and then all of a sudden this guy bust through the doors and ran and grabbed the mic on the stage and said, "Martin Luther King just got killed. All you white people better get out of Harlem." Now, and then we ran down and started looting and rioting and all that. And all that was in Harlem. So, of course, for Martin Luther King, that was huge, And when Kennedy died, the same thing. We tore up the place, you're talking about anger, but ongoing, of course, community adverse experiences, with police seeing police, and killing people around me, and of course, arrests all around me. And how did the community look, and even today, it's so important that we move our communities toward a whole nother level of health, wellness, and recovery. So yeah, I have so many community experiences, especially with, police, and of course, and hurting people, but also, I had to call the police when my dad acted out, and violently. We called the police, right? And they said, hey, back then they said, well, we're gonna take your dad for the walk now, then bring them back to the house, right? But the thing is that, treatment, where was the treatment? There wasn't no treatment in the community. Ain't nobody, I didn't even know nothing about no, there wasn't any programs where my dad could even go to, at least for African Americans, so where would he go? So yeah, many adverse experiences and how it affected the whole family in the community and how it affects the whole community. So many ways that it does when you talk about adverse community experience.
Thank you, Joe.
Go ahead, Daryl. I see you unmuted. Daryl unmuted before me a second.
No, I was already off mute. I was ready. I'm ready. I'm sitting right here. Okay.
I was just going to build on that. I think that a lot of times it's really important that we take a holistic approach. I think that we allow ourselves to dissociate, to look at individuals instead of really taking a broader systemic appreciation. And I think that a lot of times that tends to be a defense mechanism, to not realize that communities are experiencing traumatic events. I've been putting in resources and I'm still typing them in. And these are some of the resources that, I've used in some of the different TAs to really begin to get to the root, to get to the baseline of this disparity we see within communities. This is a pervasive issue. It's continual and perpetual, which lets us know that while we are serving individuals, we have to have what I like to refer to as a structural empathy, a systematic empathy, to understand how different policies, how different forms of social normative ideals have shaped these community, forms of trauma that are pervasive within, communities. And there's no shortage of resources, I find, but for some reason, they're just not prioritized. And so, I just made a note here that I wanted to talk about the compounding effects. And I think that when we're looking at adverse community effects, we're really talking about that compounding nature, that it's not just in the home, but it's in the community. And it's not just in the community, but it's in all of the different levels. So I'm a social worker. We talk about the micro, the meso, the macro, the chrono system. It's a global phenomenon. Racism and the implications of it, the detrimental life consequences of racism is a global phenomenon. And if we don't have an appreciation for that, then when we're trying to do our individual forms of intervention, we're really missing an important opportunity to engage and to connect with people. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, man, I love this conversation. I love this opportunity because you guys are, man, we should have charged y'all for this. I'm telling you right now, we should have charged you guys for coming in here because this is good stuff. Let me tell you, you're hearing Joe tell you about some historical stuff. You're getting Dr. Ashley Stewart giving you some clinical piece. And let me give you a little perspective on this. I grew up in the hood, right? I grew up in violent environments. I grew up as a young boy, right? Admiring drug dealers, the gold chains, the cars, the money. That's what I grew up in. And so violence was part of that. So after watching violence, I became a perpetrator of violence. You guys are following me on that? All right, let's spin it. Let's spin it a little bit, Tom. Tom, let's say if I grew up in a suburban environment where there are blue collar people, right? Tom's Plumbing, Joe's Electric, such and such, and I'm seeing all these different vans. Would my perception, would my growing up be different, right? I might be wanting to be an electrician or a carpenter or a plumber. So what we're saying is how environments, adverse community experiences, how they take place, how the environment actually takes. So you grow up in this way. So I aspire to be a drug dealer. I grew up in the suburbs or a place where people have homes and blue collar, whatever the case may be. And it doesn't have to be black or white. We're just talking neighborhood. How I grew up, right, would be different on what I would inspire to be. And this is how the community plays. And so when you understand that, I wrote down in a note, understanding the recipe. So when you're working with diverse communities, you got to understand the recipe before you can even attack to try to do it. If you don't understand this, when people say to us, oh, well, Daryl, I didn't grow up in the hood. I didn't smoke crack. I didn't go to jail. I don't know how to. Well, wait a minute. Understand. You don't have to do that to work with people, but understand where they came from, understand the trauma. That way you can start to work with these individuals no matter what your personal background is. Y'all with that? Thumbs up? Where we at? Let's go.
I want to add right quick, Stephen, to that as far as just the social determinants of health, because probably a lot of our participants here probably have heard of the social determinants of health, which means, again, where we work and where we play and where we live, where we eat, where we grow, and where we heal. And when you have a community, right, and all of that, we don't have none of that as far as, healthy foods, you know what I mean? It's a food desert. You know what I mean? There, and then even the playground, it might not be safe and it's dangerous. You know, the jobs, there's no jobs. You know, so in communities that suffer with these adverse community experiences, right? Again, that's where, I mean, and it can get even bigger than that with redlining, et cetera, even more so. So I think that, you know, it's a lot to the communities, again, where people come from. And then, you know, after I go to treatment, and guess what? I go to treatment, and do I come right back to that community? And you know what? And right now we're working on how do we move those community toward health, so it don't be an adverse experience of living in my community.
Right. And you know, with trauma, you know, is, you know, trauma, understanding trauma and really understanding that piece of it. And, you know, that a normal response to an abnormal situation, right? So when you're in prison, you may respond differently to a certain situation, but that's a normal response to an abnormal situation. So you're in the hood and someone pulls a gun on you, or you're in a violent environment, you have to respond normally or however you want to this abnormal situation. So we need to understand that, because a lot of times people are confused. Well, why are they, like, the news portrays people, but they don't go into the whole and how the environment and how living in poverty, right? COVID, businesses and social services being closed down. People are struggling across the country. Now put this into a poverty-stricken environment that was already suffering, and now you expect them to be like but we only focus on that. We don't focus on how that situation even got there. We're still trying to pull ourselves together from the crack epidemic, and we're right in the midst of the opioid epidemic and COVID, and now we got social justice issues going on. There's a lot of stuff spinning, and we're trying to figure out, and people are trying, you know, and a lot of finger pointing. So I'm glad, and I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here so we can have this dialogue.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Ashley, and Joe. Thank you as well. And I think this next question is, it's well connected here. How does unequal access to health insurance affect access to treatment? And to what extent do traditional treatment options reflect the needs of people of color seeking help? And before I have the speakers share, I just had this conversation with Daryl, Joe, and Ashley the other day. And one of the things Daryl said just really stuck with me, and it was about him being in a meeting, and somebody had made the comment, you know, this is like my 8th time in rehab. And for Daryl, it was shocking that anybody even had 8 times in rehab, because he had never been offered treatment that way. And for me, that just sort of brought home to me and magnified the, you know, the difference, and frankly, the privilege that I've experienced, and certainly, you know, our person who's been in rehab 8 times was able to experience as well. So I just share that because it was a powerful moment for me. So.
Yeah, just to enlighten you, like, just really quickly, like, Holly actually talked about that in the chat. One of her questions was, you know, with respect to mainstream recovery movement and primarily white communities or what have you. We're going to get to that, but what I wanted to point out for me is what Stephen was talking about, is that I remember, you know, going through the criminal justice system and pretty much begging the judge. I was addicted to crack cocaine, begging the judge for treatment. And he told me that the McDougal, which is our level 4 prison, it has an excellent drug treatment program there, right? And I was like, wow. So he wouldn't give me treatment. He said, you know, I should seek my treatment in prison, right? But then when I became a certified addictions counselor, I started to go to rehabs, and I started to see that the majority of the people in rehab were white people, mostly males, because I would go to the white treatment centers that were for males. And I would start talking, and they would say, oh, this is my 50th rehab. This is my 8th time in rehab. This is my, and they said they had never been in prison. And it just struck me. And I shared this with the group. I was like, wow, you know, so when we talk about equity, right? We're talking about equality. We're talking about equal, right? We want to talk about fairness and equity and fairness in treatment and nothing else, because, you know, the data shows that blacks and whites use substances at the same rate, yet the treatment modalities are different.
Yeah. Yeah, Daryl, the treatment modalities are different and complexly nuanced and rooted in oppression. And then, again, we hear these stories, and people's inclination, I think, oftentimes is to feel, right? But I love what this was just put in the chat, is that we must analyze how we contribute. And Cherie, you talked about referring to Jones and Okun, an incredible resource for folks who aren't familiar, an incredible resource. Yes, I am familiar with it. And we do need to really think critically about how we uphold. How we've been taught that upholding some of these forms of oppression is the normative or correct, appropriate, best organizational strategy to take.
Right.
It is literally woven into the systems, and it requires us to get out of our level of comfort of what we know, the expectation that information is going to be given to us. Because what's been provided to us oftentimes has been framed in this normative idea that is rooted in the same things that we're trying to dismantle, like we're trying to address in the work that we're doing. So these spaces are critical. I always ask folks in these types of sessions, how many conversations have you been having about race equity recently? And everyone says a whole bunch. These conversations are happening all over the place. But what we're not talking about is how we're upholding it. And I think about that as a Black woman in academia, how I uphold these forms of oppression, because I have to reconfigure the way I see or perceive things to be normatively done in order to begin to transgress that naturally sustained form of oppression. To the question, Stephen, I know we're having just a brief conversation, so I don't have all my statistics on me. I always have my data on me, but there's national research that shows that that there are disparities in access to healthcare. We know that there's those disparities exist. And even when those disparities do not exist and people have access to healthcare, there is still the cultural, organizational dynamics, the historical context of fear that has been imparted into communities of color, the medical distrust, the organizational, the treatment distrust that people experience that is real and valid. And there's a lot of data to support that it's real and valid. And so even when that disparity is reduced, there's still also difference that exists in how people utilize those forms of healthcare services, because when they go into the doctor's office or when they go into a treatment facility, they are treated with the energy that has been upholding these same issues these same concepts that we're talking about today. Because people treat them differently, because they don't see themselves represented, because there's a diverse photo on the wall, but there's no person there who can relate to their experiences, or they even perceive to be able to relate to their experiences. No one mentions or brings up issues around race and racism in the conversation and intake. And so folks don't feel safe or welcome. And we need to address that urgently. Oh, I'm getting excited. Let me just
All right.
Well, hey, Stephen, can we just shout out, I believe it's Tom, one of the things that he put in the chat box is trauma recovery and empowerment model educational groups. I salute you, brother, for that, because so many times across the country, I work with many different prisons, and trauma isn't even discussed in the process. People come in traumatized, go out worse than they came in, and never is trauma even a factor. So I salute you for the work that you do, and I'm hoping that we can stay connected as a group, because we do a lot of trauma work, and I think that one of the most, for us to move forward, and the best way to lower recidivism is to identify and work on trauma issues.
Right. And I love that, and that goes right into what the question is, when you look at what Tom has put in there, is the last sentence where it says that one of the most important aspects is to connect with each other's members' humanity, right? And be able to learn from each other. Those relationships. That's the one thing, even with Dr. DeGrew, I know with post-traumatic slaves, the next class that we took after that was the relational approach. And she put in the healing, that the healing is going to have to come in the community. So when you look at treatment and you look at healthcare and you look at, especially what African Americans has done in the past historically, you know what I mean? That's where the church has came in. Those relationships and resiliency of African Americans, that what we have done, we wasn't getting no treatment. We wasn't even allowed treatment, hospitalization, our data, we have, man, that's why I put those books in there. One is The Condemnation of Blackness, and Kahil Gibran, who works at Harvard. He's a Harvard professor now, but him and Dr. DeGruy, all of that is about the data that we have going back 400 years, right? But when did the healing? Nobody said, you know what, man, y'all have experienced all of this trauma. Why don't we make a space and a safe place and a liberating place, not just a safe place, but a liberating space where you can freely get all of the health care so you can heal from all of this that you've experienced, right? So I think that even with the resiliency from the church and on our own creations and our own paths of the relationships that we have, even today, is so important there because of treatment. Treatment and healthcare, we are asking today, that how do African Americans, especially communities, what is it in the community that, how do we heal? What relationships it has to be formed? Can we go to treatment? Now I put a lot of people, and I'm also, licensed chemical dependency counselor 30 years. So I worked in treatment, ran a treatment and all that. But again, it's not specifically for African Americans. Even the intake, the process, the 12 core functions, everything that come with treatment. There's not one question on was there any barrier or what was any challenges for you while Black? Was there any racism, that caused challenges or was a barrier for you to get treatment and recovery? Right? Those questions are not asked. Guess what? Today, I even with the local behavioral health authority, and I went through their training to be, the cultural trainer. But the thing is that was for all of the therapists, in the behavioral, hundreds of them came to this training to learn how do you ask the question? They're not even asking the question. What is it like? And these are folks that's come into treatment that are people of color, but ain't nobody asking me nothing about, was there any barriers? Was there any challenges? Did that cause you to relapse? Is racism causing you to relapse? None of that is asked in treatment, okay? Or none of that is asked. So it's our job now in recovery to make sure that we put this forth.
All right. The importance of asking the right questions. For so long, it's been tradition to say what's wrong with you and not asking what happened to you, right? When we start to ask what happened to someone, the answers are different from what's wrong with you. And many of us that are in recovery or from whatever, everybody's in recovery from something. But imagine the conversation when you say to someone, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you.
You better be prepared for the answers though, too.
And that's right. You know what? While we have a quick second, while Stephen's getting the next question, I wanna point this out to you that the challenges of us who try to get people into treatment, and understanding that for me, I know it's a struggle when a person is addicted to crack cocaine or PCP, because those are typical urban drugs, if you will. Whereas somebody that's addicted to opioids or alcohol, it's a lot easier to get them into treatment. And many of my colleagues are saying that they have to basically lie to get somebody into treatment. They have to say, oh, tell them that you're drinking, or tell them that you're drinking more than your crack so you can get into treatment. Well, when we go back and we look at who's more prevalent to use crack cocaine, who's more prevalent to use PCP, and so even the systems are kind of designed to open the door for certain people, and other people, oh no, we don't treat crack here. We don't have a treatment. We don't have a detox for crack. We don't have a space for those crack or PCP users. But if you do alcohol, if you are addicted to pills, come right in. So we need to challenge the system and look at that. And for a long time, we just thought it was the norm. But when you started to say, wait a minute, where are the crack people supposed to go? Where are the people that are Where are they? How are they supposed to get into treatment? And they say, oh, well, the insurance doesn't cover it. You know, and these are, then why not? Addiction is addiction, right? People struggling are struggling. So we shouldn't have, you know, it shouldn't be a more level of treatment, right? You know, even in the prison system, if you're a cocaine user, you're here. If you're a crack user, you're here. You know, and people say, oh, well, at least I didn't smoke crack. I'm like, bro, you were on a moped naked the other day riding down the street. Yeah, but I wasn't smoking crack, right? So here's this hierarchy even in drug use. And so we have to think about how we're treating people when we're building these systems.
Sometimes I'm just speechless. I just want to get out of your way and let the three of you just talk. There's a question that was in the chat from Holly that I think it's a really important one. Let me share it with everybody. With respect to the mainstream recovery movement and its genesis within primarily white communities, can you comment on how recovery communities can be more inclusive of other cultural experiences?
I'm gonna let Ashley jump in. I see she came off the wall kind of quick. I thought she was coming to my computer. That 3D computer. I was like, whoa, wait.
I was sitting back and listening, so I had to move in. But you know, I have thoughts. And you know, we've kind of talked about some of them. I talked about you know, being prepared, and doing the research, listening to people's lived narratives. What are people telling you about how they're experiencing? I mean, we're hearing folks' experiences in this room that would inform how we include more inclusive and cultural practices. It's about, you know, taking the initiative and doing the work to be able to understand how it differs for folk on a real in a real present way. Then I think that the step right before that, and I think that this is like something that I think about a lot. The step before that, I want to go back to the question. So how do we, I've lost. Oh yeah. So how do we, how can our recovery communities be more inclusive of their cultural experiences? That's what we need to answer. And the step that I take right before that is, are we ready to? Are the folks within the community, within their recovery spaces, within the organization, ready and prepared for the shift that would take when it was more culturally responsive? Are we ready to support the emotional well-being of folk who are coming with these lived narratives and these true stories about their lives, who are coming with these years and decades and lifetimes, generations of harm? And we can be ready. It's not a hypothetical question. We literally can be prepared to do so, but are we prepared to? One of the things that I noticed that a lot of times we like to move straight into action. We're going to create a group or a task group, or we're going to change forms, but we have to have an appreciation so that it's delivered authentically. So I know we're going to answer that question, but I wanted to take us a step back before that too, just to have a moment to think, are we ready? Have we done the work to ensure that everyone in this space is committed to the longevity and the resource that will need to be poured into it, and the literal self-work reflection that each and every single individual in this agency is going to need to commit to in order for it to be done appropriately, authentically, in a way that won't further perpetuate harm? And once we get to that space, I mean, people are going to feel the difference. And I think that that's a great starting point. But I'll let my my colleagues respond, and then hopefully we can provide some other tangible things as well. I mean, that's a tangible thing, and I like to reinforce that is also a tangible thing. But say you've done that pre-step, we have some ideas as well.
I like to give them a gut shot. You know, I like to give them a gut shot. And when I say that, man, let's bring it back to EBPs, right? Every time you try to get some money, is it evidence-based? Is it evidence-based practice? That's usually the barrier or the controlling factor if you can get funding into this organization. These EBPs should be inclusive culturally, because when you look at them, this is an evidence-based practice, but does it talk about culture? Does it talk about addressing people of color? Does it talk about this organization, in order for you to do this, make sure it's culturally responsive. And I know there's some, but there's not enough, right? And they don't force the government or these funding organizations do not force you to be inclusive, right? So that allows you to be exclusive, right? So you could get this money. And when you think about fundraising, right? If I'm in the hood, I'm fundraising, maybe we make $500 at our sober dance, while somebody in the suburbs can have the same event and they raise 50,000 because of the members, right? So we talk about exclusive and inclusive. So if you're going to call yourself a recovery community organization, then it needs to be inclusive of everybody. Because when I smoked crack, no one stopped the white guy at the door and said, you know, only black people can smoke here. There was never that. It was inclusive. It was inclusive. So why is it when you get out of and you're getting to recovery, now all of a sudden you got to be checked at that, oh, well, you know what, we only take this type of certain person here. And it doesn't even have to be verbal. I'm watching this even in my own recovery community. Certain people go hiking and snowmobiling and other people have cookouts, right? Why aren't they inclusive? And it's in the pictures, right? They're not, and mind you, I'm not asking to go snowmobiling. I don't like the cold, but I'm just saying I wouldn't mind being invited. I wouldn't mind being invited. At least invite me on the hike so I can tell you no. But you know what I mean? But that's not even happening. So we need to be conscious of that.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. I put a couple of things in the chat there also, which is on YouTube. One is Dr. D'Angelo's White Fragility book, and she's talking about that. And then Peggy McIntosh, too, is a great social worker that for years, she talks about the invisible knapsack that she carried around for years of undeserved white privilege, she calls it, that she had. She didn't know she had all of this, right? And so she's on YouTube. She's got several articles and several things out. She's been doing this for a while. The other thing is definitely, I think that as far as the relationships and the allies that we do have, I have to look at what relationships that I have of our allies, right? Of people that really want to move forward. Because I get a lot of questions lately. You know, I mean, with Joe, what could we do as white people? How can I, help out? Well, the thing is for you, first of all, for you to get your own education, right? You need to get educated for it. I usually give them these two. I'll tell them about Dr. D'Angelo. And then, so they can, learn, I mean, again, and then these books that I put in there earlier, all of these books here, of course, all the way from Thurgood Marshall to whatever, but to read and to learn, and then also if you can personalize it, that's just like becoming a recovery coach. A recovery coach, I tell people, if you can't personalize this, then you don't need to be no coach. One, you can't tell your own story. Because we had a lot of professionals that say, well, I want to be a recovery coach, but they don't want to disclose or say, I'm a person with lived experience, though, right? So that means that, hey, so I can't, I must be working at the Coca-Cola plant. If I can't personalize, I can't work in the field. How can I connect with somebody and meet somebody where they are? And it's all about this assessment tool that I've got here, So I don't want, the thing is that I think for your question too, as far as getting started and also our allies, because I'm working with a lot of people now, to put something together. Ashley really, of course, he's a curriculum developer. When you look at what is curriculum and how do you involve and, include people to develop something where we can all learn from and live and grow from.
Joe, Ashley, Daryl, thank you again. Again, I keep saying this, but I could just get out of your way and let the three of you just chat. And all of us would walk away from this more informed. And I think just having a deeper appreciation and respect for what is happening and what has happened. What I think is probably a good point for us to turn this back to Ashley, let her move through some of the strategies that we have that we hope will be helpful. And then if we've got a little bit of time after Ashley completes that, I may be able to squeeze in another question. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah, I'm gonna move through them quickly because I see so much power in hearing folks share. So let's get through these quickly so we do have time for another question. There's these resources. There's one that just recently came out on the opioid crisis in Black African American populations, as well as one on Latinx populations that are just, I find to be great resources that provide statistics and data on the disproportionate impact and the disparity in support. It also provides this one in particular provides a great outline of what are some of the challenges, talking about stereotypes and stigmas and representation, things that came out today, discussing and providing the support for talking about intergenerational trauma, fear of criminality, lack of information, lack of cultural responsiveness. We know these things are true. These are things that have come up in this space today. They also provide some really transparent responses, like taking a holistic approach or using community partnerships, right? Connecting with organizations that have been and always will be central parts of communities of color in empowering those relationships, appreciation for cultural dynamics, and diversifying the workforce. These are some of the things that we know. There's lots of things that have been published about it. We can go to the next slide, but I feel like a part where we are really missing the opportunity to engage is to talk about how this looks within our organization, or how we can be able to use some of the strategies that we know are working well to move us past that place of discomfort. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in the work that we all do is about different stages of change, and we use different language. We refer to it differently. This is just a very generic diagram here. But at the root of it, what we're really examining is that there are going to be people within your organizations, there are going to be people at different agencies that are varying parts of readiness to engage in systemic and structural change, to be able to provide the type of necessary support that would really move us to a new way of doing things, as opposed to regurgitating some of the information without that sustainability. And one of the things that we have to realize is that it's going to continue to go. And if there's someone who is still in preparation to embrace the shifts and the changes that are going to occur, we respect and we honor that, but we continue through the process from an organizational level. We don't have a lot of time today, but one of the things that we do talk about and some of the work that we're doing is how this all fits together. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so one thing that I think, these are going to summarize some of the points. It's amazing how some of the points fit in perfectly with what was shared today. Having had the privilege and opportunity to hear Joe and Daryl speak, really hoping to capture and summarize some of what we discussed today, but certainly not all of it. Understanding and acknowledging that it's our responsibility, each and every person. We sometimes like to bring folk in with different expertise, but the commitment to doing this work is ours. Understanding that discomfort is a part of the process, and embracing it and being prepared for it in any and every inevitable step of the way. Shifting the narrative to examine our positionality. I think this was captured well in the chat today through what folks were sharing, finding and examining the ways that we contribute to it. Understanding that the idea of being anti-racist is not a badge or something we wear, it's actionable. And so with our commitment to it, it should be immediately tied to an action. It's nice to leave these spaces and be like, thank you, this was great, I learned a lot. Action. And that doesn't have to be something grand. It could be saying, we really don't have anything face front in our organization, or even in my personal office, or whatever that looks like, that lets people know that I am committed to having conversations about inequity. I am committed to having conversations about anti-racist opportunities to push us and talk about racism explicitly. And which goes into the next point of being clear. A lot of times we like to use terms that make a bunch of folk comfortable. And it's really important to realize that a lot of folks have been living in discomfort or occupying spaces that never felt for them. And so by naming things like racism, like naming things like cultural imperialism, or some of the terms that we train folk to use, really help people say, wow, this is going beyond the superficiality that I'm used to, that I see often. Reevaluating outreach processes. Who are we deferring to when we see the gaps instead of leaning into our own lack of knowledge? Are we creating space for thoughts and expression of feelings? Are people's narratives being shared and heard and valued? And then a point that I think was especially profound that Joe shared is what has to be uncovered for recovery to really begin. So if we can go to the next slide. These are just some quick takeaways, things to consider and strategies to change. Is that stop if there isn't representation. To ask, how has racism impacted people's recovery? This is a concept that came up today. Understanding adverse community experiences, developing that structural empathy that we were talking about earlier. And be clear, understanding that comfort is rooted in privilege. And if you're going to create a space that feels welcoming and culturally responsive, that's going to mean shifting our own comfort level to be immersed in or represent authentically other folks' culture, which, you know, is just a small initiative in the broader spectrum of the work that we need to do. And then if we go to the next slide, I'm sure Joe and Daryl have some things to share. We have these resources here, but there were also a lot of resources that were shared in the chat. We're going to make sure that you get all of those, especially if you didn't get a chance to write everything down. We'll make sure that you have access to all the resources shared today. And then, I'll pass it to Stephen to talk about what's coming up next before we go into our final closing remarks.
Ashley, thank you, and just appreciate you taking that, the time to go through the, really strategies and how can we make a difference? And I think this last question, there are still several incredibly important questions, but I think listening to you and thinking about having these conversations, and I think the three of you will remember when I began to share. I talked about how uncomfortable it is and how difficult it can be because it's not your responsibility to tell us where we screwed this up, but I don't know how many landmines I might be stepping on as I am trying to kind of fumble my way through the conversation. And I think, that there is a tendency for us to sort of default to defense that, that we're somehow under attack for the way that we're thinking. And I don't think that those are the best choice of words there, but I know how that it feels. It's, you feel uncomfortable, and it stops the conversation. And there's a point where you sort of have to live in that uncomfortableness. And so the question is, how can we have these conversations constructively and respond to that defensiveness?
Yeah, I think there's a natural tendency to think that these conversations are divisive. And I think that you're right. When we're seeing these conversations as divisive, it really is a demonstration of our lack of preparedness to engage in the conversation. I mentioned earlier that there's no shortage of information to support all the things. It just hasn't been prioritized. And I find that when we're in situations where we just don't know, and I use the term ignorance, I mean in little terms, like literal things that we don't know, gaps in our knowledge, we feel as though we have to fish or pull or defend what we're saying. But really, if we just rely on the information that's there and clearly available, we can have really constructive conversations. I think it's about appreciating that people are at different stages in this process. But the one thing that I think is critical when we're having these complex conversations is to realize where we're starting. If we are starting at the conversation at a point where we're debating someone's humanity, the conversation's headed in the wrong direction. It's not a conversation that is respectful to even the intent of what we are trying to do. And if we're entering the conversation at a place that doesn't recognize that we have the privilege to discuss someone's humanity even. Right? We get to decide whether or not to make our places of employment, our places of community more inclusive. That's the starting point. And so establishing that respect of the position, of the privilege that comes with the conversations, I think is an important first step.
Right.
I love it. I love it. And then also, Ashley actually put it in stages of change format as far as where is a person at that time? Can they be a part of the conversation without being uncomfortable, or can they, and this is all new. I mean, it's going to be uncomfortable at times. I think that community conversations, the conversation cafe, one I think Daryl and Ashley and Stephen and all of us, we talked about even the shop talk, which is the barber shop, now that here in my community, we got the police that's actually going into the barber shop, and they've made it a huge initiative now, in the community, how the police can go, and they don't know that still that's a threat. You coming in there with your uniform on and think that it's going to be free. That's not liberating space. That might be a safe place called the police for some, or whatever that safe might be. But as far as liberating, freedom for me to really to speak my truth, freedom to really say how I feel, freedom to really give, who I am, and to be. And that's what we want. I think that these conversations throughout the community with our community partners, I know I'm doing a lot now and more with all of the community agencies and partners. And again, and what does this look like as far as racial equity in there, and not being afraid, right, to really to even have the conversation, and what does that look like? Because if we don't say it, ain't nobody gonna say it. It's gonna stay hidden. We've got to be, our voice must be heard. I think that's where peer support coming at, recovery movement. I always say now, instead of recovery-oriented systems of care, which I do work with some systems, but recovery-oriented communities of care. And how do I really move this community toward health, wellness, and recovery?
Right. I agree, man. And so man, this is such a robust, and I really, really once again want to thank everybody that attended. This Zoom should have been packed, right? It should have been 1 million people here. Like you shouldn't have been able to get in, but it's such an uncomfortable conversation that people don't even want to have it, right? They don't want to have it, or they'll throw stuff up on social media, and you can find out who your unsmart friends are, if you will, right? Who are not that smart. They just throw things up because they're not knowledgeable, nor are they willing to have the conversation. And what I would encourage you all to do is look at that stages of change. Number one, see where you're at. Are you in the action stage? Are you in pre-contemplation? Are you in contemplation? Because when you get to that and you understand that, you can start to examine where your organization is at. And that's how you're going to start to move the needle, because it's not just putting a Black Lives Matter sign on your front lawn. That's nice, but that's not action. It's not going to the march. That's not action. It's actually making change and stuff, even if it's just conversation. I tell people, oh, you went to the Black Lives Matter? Yeah, it was like 5,000 people. It was great. How many Black people did you meet? Oh, we didn't meet any new Black people. And then I say to my Black friends, okay, so you went to the march. Yeah, it was great. It was great. How many white people did you meet? Oh, no, we didn't meet any white people. So you were at an event where there were 5,000 people. It was about racial equality, and you did not interact with anyone of another race? You didn't bring home some new numbers, no networking, no nothing? Then you wasted your time. You wasted your time, because until we start networking and realizing that if you're an accountant, then come to the Black community and teach financial wellness. If you are a cook and you are a Black chef, go to the suburban community and teach how to make soul food. I don't care what it is, but the network becomes your net worth. And once we start to understand that, that's when change really starts to happen. Until then, it's just, people just talking. I really appreciate what you do, Tom. I really appreciate, because you're in the prison where 75% are Black and brown people, right? So here's this white guy trying to teach about trauma. You are doing your part, right? You're doing your part, because we know if I learn about trauma from you and you teach me how to live, I might have an opportunity to go home and be a father and a prospective role model in my community, right? We talk about the ripple effect. You guys here will be like that rock going into the pond that ripples out what you heard here today. It is your responsibility to take it back to your community and figure out how do we engage.
Beautifully stated. Just so powerful. And it's 2:15, 3:15 on the East and earlier in the West. I just want to say, look, as we close today, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Mr. Powell. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. And thank you, Mr. McGraw, because we need these conversations on a regular basis. It just has to happen. I want to thank SAMHSA and the ORN team just for giving us this opportunity, because it was really important. And please consider joining us again on November 10th. We're going to be discussing developing the peer workforce through training, internships, and job placement. In December, we're going to look at, this is on the 8th, exploring reimbursement for peer support services through Medicaid. And we hope that all of you can join us again. Again, thank you all for your time today. A special thank you to the speakers for giving us their time today. We know how valuable it is for all of you. We hope we made good use of it for all of you as well. Have a fabulous close to your Tuesday, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.